Joining me today is Dr. Shannon Cunny, a computer scientist, legal scholar, and senior lecturer at the University of Melbourne. He's won awards in research, teaching, and hacking, and has advised both the FTC and the U.S. Senate on tech policy. Shannon also has experience cracking safes, singing competitively, and playing piano. Shannon, welcome to the Zappable podcast.
Thanks. It's lovely to be here this morning.
So Shannon, since you have both experience in music and computer science, is there anything common that draws you to both of them?
Yeah, and I think this actually runs pretty deep, some of the connections. Everyone talks about how music is very mathematical, but it's not often enough that people actually explicate what they mean by that. And there are a couple of popular music theoreticians on YouTube who kind of go into this a bit more. And there was one that I came across a couple weeks ago, which charted out a beautiful graph of what music naturally is going to sound good to human ears. And one of the things there is that depending on the environment in which you're raised, different music sounds good. So if you're raised in Bali, gong music might sound really great to you that operates on a different tuning system. Or if you're raised in the West, the music that we hear, like classical Western music, has a certain sound to it. And these are all built on mathematical relationships, and depending on the country that you grow up in or the musical culture, this is going to be different. But it turns out that there are these super interesting mathematical relationships between the music that's likely to sound good and the music that's not going to be good. And so you can do these like music plus code visualizations that are really awesome of this type of thing. There was I think a 1993 paper by William Setheres, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, around the relationship between psychoacoustics, which is the study of like how humans perceive music, and the mathematical kind of nature of music. And so for me, that kind of ties very nicely into this kind of analytical way of viewing the world. And at the same time, there's like the flip side of music, which most people think about, which is the kind of more emotional, cultural, social experience of it. And there, I think code has something similar to that as well that we often lose sight of, which is that software development is also a social practice, or at least it has been up until recently. And so everything from the early days of like Unix hackers working together over bulletin boards or the notion of pair programming, there's also this kind of sense in which coding is a craft and an art. There's Donald Knuth's famous book, The Art of Programming. And so there are these kind of like interesting parallels behind the way that programmers approach the craft of writing code and the way that musicians think about the craft of writing music. Now, that's kind of breaking down on both sides a little bit with AI, but I think those kind of like links between them are something that I appreciate even when I'm actually doing music. I think you try and get into this kind of flow state, which is like just like code, when you get in the flow state, you're not necessarily thinking about all of those aspects at the same time. So for me, they're like two sides of a similar coin.
Okay, interesting. And since you mentioned how AI is affecting things, do you think that music that's AI generated is valid music, or what are your thoughts about that?
So I think this is where it becomes really important to separate out music as a product from music as something more social and more artistic, more craft-worthy. There was a beautiful video essay that Adam Neely, who's a popular online music theoretician, put out called Suno AI Music and the Bad Future. And he brought in a number of sources, one of which is one of my favorite ways to think about music, which is that of musicking, which is an idea from Christopher Small, who is another ethnomusicologist. And that's the idea that music, more than an output, which is how we've been treating it in the last century with like recorded music, music is a social practice. And so that's everything from listening to music. You have to be actively engaged. You're relating it to your own culture. You often listen to music with other people. There's definitely a lot of social context there, and also music creation and music performance. And up until like the last century or two, a lot of people's experience of music was either going to the big concert hall when someone comes into town, but much more commonly like making music in the community. So whether that's liturgical music in your church or synagogue or mosque, or whether that is just banging on things when you're singing around, or old slave songs, all of these were cultural practices. And I think what's happened particularly in the last like 50, 60 years, is that link has been increasingly broken, and people are seeing music much more as the product rather than as the social and cultural experience. And so I think some of this AI-generated music is taking that to the far extreme. And so is it music in the sense of music, the product? Sure. But I think there is something important missing when you take away this element of cultural, social experience and this element of craft. And then there's also a lot more that I could say about like the process of creation and where that goes, but happy to dig into that if that's interesting to you and your audience.
Right. I mean, I guess I hear if people want, let's say, something to share with their friends or to go to a concert together, they want something more unique. So they want to know people struggle to make this song. But if they're just like listening to music in the background while they're running or something like that, then probably they don't care as much. And then AI-generated music could easily meet that need.
It could. A lot of the AI-generated music, at least to my taste, is just bad. And I mean that from a somewhat subjective, but a critical lens. So if you look at the construction of AI music, there are often things that it's missing. So the lyrics can be very repetitive and not have actual depth while having the semblance of depth. And that's not because, in theory, AI could never generate meaningful lyrics, but at least as from an objective standpoint, today the lyrics are rather trite and the rhyming structures are fairly simple. One of the reasons people really like Eminem is not because the harmonic construction of the music is that amazing, but because he does an amazing job with rhyme and lyric. And even in just that one small aspect of the AI music, it's really clear if you pay attention to it for more than a few seconds that it's not there. So I find it annoying to listen to, but that is in some sense a matter of aesthetic preference. Perhaps because I've trained in music, I have more of a gut reaction. Do I think some people could obtain some utility from it? Sure. But I think there is a sense in which, at least for now, something is missing, both on that like kind of more philosophical social side, but also on the more like what is the actual product in front of us.
I mean, on the technical level, I feel like they'll get there soon enough, or maybe people just need to work on their prompting a little bit, because that seems like they've gotten so good at all these kind of areas. So maybe we'll see in a few months. But
maybe. Like there was AI-generated Bach, which was like pre-generative AI. And this was purpose-built models that were designed to mimic the harmonic structures of Johann Sebastian Bach's music, in particular his fugues, to the point where experts couldn't really tell whether the composition was Bach or not. But there still seems to be something missing, at least with the generative tools that we're creating today. How soon we get there, I don't know. Will I be able to tell at some point? I don't know.
Okay, so turning to another topic, you have extensive experience with software security, but also a little bit on the physical side, but with even breaking into locks. Is there anything in common between those two areas, or it's just separate areas of interest for you?
This goes back to a fairly deep connection between physical security and kind of computer security. I wouldn't even say I do software security, because to me that's looking at far too narrow a part of the system. The way that a really good red teamer or the way a really good security professional will look at things is as an entire system. And locks are a really nice example of this, because you can look at just a very specific element. So the theoretical construction of the lock and the matching to a specific key. So there's a certain key space, depending on how many pins there are, you can figure out how many different possible keys there are, and that's all well and good. But to actually build this thing, to instantiate it in the real world, there are a lot of considerations that you need to take into account. And this is where lock pickers think about locks in a similar way to the way that computer security people think about computer systems. So when you make a real lock, there are like machining tolerances. And those machining tolerances come into play when you're actually lock picking. You're relying on the fact that not only are certain combinations of pins ineffective when you would put them in a real world lock, but the quality of the machining of the lock itself leaves imperfections that you can exploit as a lock picker. Now, a really good physical security person as well also doesn't stop at the lock. The lock is within a door. The door has a latch mechanism. Perhaps you don't actually have to pick the lock. You can bypass the lock by toying with the latch. Or if you're a common criminal, you go through the window and ignore the lock in the first place. And these same parallels really do carry over quite closely to computer security. We talk a lot about attacker-defender asymmetry. So the defender needs to ensure the entire system is secure, whereas the attacker only needs to find the weakest point. And that weakest point in our lock analogy might be the pins, it might be the pinning, it might be the lamb of the door. That's a part of the door. It might be the window that's been left open. And so that parallel is a really good way to teach people about how to apply systems thinking. Now, there are also other things that we can learn from locks and lockpicking. Firstly, there's a cultural aspect of it from the 70s and 80s around the way that hackers thought about experimentation and gaining knowledge. And the same kind of tools that hackers applied to locks is the exact same philosophy that they applied to early computer systems. So there was a great work by one of my mentors, Matt Blaze, on master keying, which is the notion that if you're in a large corporate building, you can have a single key that unlocks every door, called the master key, and then you can also have subkeys that unlock a subset of doors, or maybe even only a single door. And in Matt Blaze's paper, he demonstrated a physical privilege escalation attack. And privilege escalation is when you have some normal level of access, and you can use that normal level of access to gain administrator or privileged access. And he showed that even with a normal key, a subkey on a master keyed system, you can escalate that up to get the actual master key on certain kinds of master keyed systems. Now, he copped a lot of flack for this because the locksmiths guilds were not happy about the fact that this information was now public, and he received threats of all sorts, including death threats. But this kind of parallels what people in computer security say, which is that you shouldn't rely on the secrecy of the design of the system in order to protect the system itself. This is Kirchhoff's principle. And so this was a real physical analog of that principle that applied very directly in digital systems. So you've got all of these different individual lessons you can learn. You learn about the culture of hacking. You learn about particular types of attacks and ways of thinking about things. You can learn about the principles. So I think it's a skill that every computer security person should try their hand at least with for a few minutes.
Have you ever used your lockpicking skills in practice in the real world?
Within the past 2 weeks, yes, but no comment. I am very... This gets me into trouble quite a lot. I'm very good at losing keys, forgetting keys, locking myself out of buildings, etc. And so having skills in physical security has come in handy more than once. The most prominent of these was when I was a graduate student. I locked myself out of the dorm, which at that point, this wasn't a lockpicking attack, but similar physical security. I came up with a way of getting back into the building by bypassing the security systems on the dorms. And that resulted in more than a little trouble for me, shall we say. But it has proven a useful practical skill lots of times as well.
So usually you're breaking into areas that you should have access to, you just are missing your key.
Exactly. So that's how I stay on the right side of the law. I break into things, but they're things that I should have access to, but for some reason I don't.
Yeah, I mean, one interesting difference, I guess, between physical security and like software security, I feel like once you're on the internet, if there's a vulnerability, something will find it. Like you're open to the whole world. There's no risk for people from another country trying to break in. And physical security, I feel like just needs to be like, okay. And then usually like there aren't so many people trying to physically break into buildings. So once you reach a certain level, it's usually good enough.
I think that is true to a certain extent of software security, but this tells us a bit about the role that locks actually play in life. But picking a lock is not actually that hard. In particular, the locks on most people's houses, at least when you imagine the American white picket fence house with the front door, those locks are typically not very secure. It would likely take me under 30 seconds to bypass or to pick any given house lock. But the point isn't to stop people from getting in with some high security mechanism. It's a social deterrent. It's just like the way that you might leave your bedroom door closed when you're having friends over to an apartment. It's not that that actually provides any great deal of security, or that if they look through the door, they'd see anything so terrible, depending on how messy your bedroom is. It's more a social sign about where the boundary is being set. If someone wants to break into your house, they can. Most likely by either tailgating someone through the security door and kicking the door down, or bashing in a window. It's more that it adds just that little bit of friction and that little bit of social signaling. And this does happen in software security as well. Not quite as much with the signaling, but to the extent that adding a bit of friction makes you a slightly less soft target, and so you're no longer a target of opportunity. A lot of crime, not all of it, there certainly are more sophisticated attacks, but a lot of crime does happen by moments of opportunity where someone sees that a door has been left open, or a car has its lights on and it's been left outside and the key is still in the ignition. All those types of things are scenarios that someone might take advantage of. And so the function of both your firewall and your basic security hygiene and the lock on your home is not necessarily to produce a technical impediment that a nation state couldn't bypass. It's more to provide that little bit of friction and that little bit of social signal.
Yeah, now turning to your experience teaching computer science, so you have extensive experience there. How have you noticed that it's changed recently as, generative AI has become so common and powerful?
This is the doom and gloom part. So most of the people teaching introductory classes, and I count myself among them, are in a state of mild depression and slight panic, except the people who are close enough to retiring that they don't have to worry. What we've seen is that software tasks that would traditionally give in an intro programming class, so go home, work on this assignment for 2 weeks, skill up a little bit, learn basic programming paradigms and abstraction, those tasks are no longer actually completed by our students. Or to the extent that they're completed by our students, they're a student prompting an agent once and then copying and pasting the output into our submission system. One of my TAs estimated that somewhere between 70 and 90% of the submissions that he graded had clear hallmarks of AI use. And to give you a sense of how he picked up on that, so my class, I teach an introduction to C programming. It's data structures and algorithms through the lens of C. And in a typical year, we would teach some of the more interesting C keywords, so stuff like static and volatile. I might mention those, but I'd almost never see a student use it in an assignment because that level of sophistication often comes with experience, knowing about variable lifetimes in detail enough to think about how to manage those. Typically, students would have messy variables, messy variable names, structure that was imperfect, and yet assignment after assignment used sophisticated constructs and paradigms in C that I'd never seen previously in my career. And this is also true of my TA. This is what he picked up on. And this to us flags that the students are no longer completing the work. And so that's on the side of just, I think, a little bit of frustration, because as much as we communicate that the only way to develop these skills is by doing the work, the students, for whatever reason, don't do that. And they all have legitimate reasons. Life is stressful. This is more effective. Am I ever going to actually need to program? But I do still think that we're missing something by not teaching them how to think like a computer scientist. There's the other view, which is, well, maybe thinking like a computer scientist needs to change. Maybe you don't need to think about code itself, because I think all of us are slowly coming around to the reality, or some of us faster than others, that humans probably won't be needed to write very much code in the future. I don't write very much code now, and previously that was something I really enjoyed as an artistic or craftful endeavor, was writing the perfect little function that did an algorithm in much more efficient time. And now I do what everyone else does and prompt the machines. And so this is causing also a moment of self-reflection and inner turmoil around, like, what is our role here as educators? What should we be teaching? And so at least at that kind of introductory level, things have really changed. Now, for higher up levels, once students have attained a baseline of skills and you're starting to do things in a more sophisticated manner or teach pure theory, I think there is still a little more room for hope, and I'm happy to chat a bit more about that if that's interesting.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is an interesting question in terms of what do you think the goal is now? Because not only could AI do small level coding, but it's starting to be able to do like complete projects almost. I mean, we still need a human currently prompting it, but we don't need a person as involved in the technical details. So what should the goal be? Like, what is the student trying to learn? What are we trying to accomplish?
So I teach at two very different places. So this fall, I'm going to be teaching at Tufts, which is a kind of, you can think of as a liberal arts college with a research focus. I mean, it graduates doctoral students, but it's small classes, kind of seminar style. That's on one side. On the opposite side, I teach at the University of Melbourne, which is a large state school, and my smallest class is 400 students. And the kinds of things that you might think about teaching, or the way that you teach, has to shift a lot. I think, for me, one of the things I want to actually communicate in my lectures is the beauty of the topic, to encourage self-motivation and self-exploration. Because coding and computer science is, in many ways, a craft. It's a skill. It's something you have to spend your own time on or you're not going to get better at. If you want to work producing slop applications for SMEs, AI can do that. But at least as an educator, that's not my goal. That's not what I want to do. What I want to do is cultivate individual growth and judgment, try and motivate the students to understand why they might pursue their own learning in the area. Because again, I only have them for one class, or maybe if I'm lucky, I see them for 3 to 4 years. And after that, it's going to be their own sense of wanting to learn and their own sense of motivation and a level of autodidacticism that really drives them. One of the hallmarks of a programming career, of an engineering career, is this need to constantly be staying up to date. And if I can't give that passion to them, then I think I've really lost out. And that is true even before bringing AI in. Even when they were writing the code themselves, there were students who would pay someone overseas to write their assignment for them, like contract cheating, or they would get a friend to help. And so I think that actually hasn't changed that much. So if I keep my view on that kind of passion, on that motivation, and socializing them to the disciplinary norms of computer science, I think there's still some hope. If we're thinking about skills development, like specific skills in class, I think that's where the deeper concern is, not only because everything is changing so quickly, but because I find it very hard to predict what useful things I can teach them now that they will still use in 4 years. Now, college education has never been about vocational training directly. I mean, med school and law school a little more so. But even in law school, they teach you how to read appellate opinions. They don't spend as much time teaching you how to redline contracts that you're swapping between firms. So college has always been this disconnected place where you do learn skills, but the skills you learn aren't always necessarily directly transferable. And there was a result from the last census, I think the last US census, which showed that only about 28% of people who graduated from STEM majors ended up in a STEM profession as narrowly defined. I mean, that's probably a bit of an undercount for various reasons. They didn't include medicine and healthcare, but at the same time, we still seem to be communicating something valuable. And so I think this is a moment for us to ask, okay, what are those valuable things that we're communicating, that we're teaching, that aren't the specific thing that they're going to be doing in the day-to-day job? And in that way, I think this AI moment is actually quite empowering, even as it is depressing at the same time, because we have this real forced opportunity to go back and think, okay, what are we actually doing here? And I think we can make some good of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Schools do say they're not trying to teach for a vocation. I do feel like a lot of students, that's why they're going to school, either to learn the practical skills or to get the credential that they need. So it's interesting that computer science, the actual computer science major was never entirely practical focused. They have parts of math that usually aren't needed on a typical job. But it did seem like it was overall like, okay, this is a practical field. And now areas of it that seem so practical, like learning how to code, it's just a question now, like, is this even going to be used? So it's interesting that now it's becoming a theoretical topic that we're sort of teaching just for its own sake. So I'm wondering, could you formulate, like, what is the purpose if it's not as practical as it was?
So I think there are a few things. The first is we have to be realistic and recognize that for many people, college was not required to learn computer science. You could go online and watch CS50, and I've taught with them before, that's wonderful, and you can actually become a damn competent computer scientist just by consuming online materials. So to me, it was obvious that something more is happening here. One aspect of it could be credentialing, as you said, like a degree from Berkeley is going to open doors for you that a few online Coursera courses won't. And so to the extent that what we're doing is credentialing, it'll still probably function much the same. What I think is interesting there is that it does further weaken the link between what the employers claim that the credential is communicating to them versus what it's actually doing. And we're being realistic about it. We're pretty aware now that a lot of what happens is a filtering process that happens pre-admissions. So the university or the college is already taking students who have jumped through certain hoops And then attending the university for 4 years is not actually about the skill development. It's about certifying that they jump through that initial pre-admission hoop. Now, that's not a type of education that I particularly care about. And so if I were to take the extreme position on that, I would say, let's stop worrying about assessment in the university whatsoever, because the credential was never tied to the assessment in the first place. It was tied to their high school ability to jump through hoops. Now, this does put a bit more of a burden on future employers who now have to do even more weeding if we're not doing any assessing whatsoever in the university, or maybe put some more burden on the poor college students who now have to work even harder to prove themselves earlier in life and can't distinguish themselves in college. But I do think that de-emphasizing assessment is one path to helping us care more about some of the things that education can do when we're not as focused on the hoop jumping. So one thing that I think we can and should do is try and take advantage of the way that AI can maybe give us some more efficiencies in our teaching, and then allow us to provide much more personalized attention to students and focus on individual goals and individual growth, and also individual interests. I have students in my intro to programming class, and all they want to do in life is make things. And so for those students, giving them tools and helping them put themselves in an environment where they learn how to use what's out there to build the projects of their dreams could be very empowering. And on the other hand, I have students who are much more theory-driven and who couldn't care less about building a distributed system, but really want to understand the nature of computation. And for them also, I can't serve them at the moment so well. In a class of 400, 500 students, I have to kind of cater to a middle path, which up until now has been this kind of forced credentialing function. So maybe if I can offload some of the rote stuff to AI, then I can spend a little more time tailoring my core efforts to these groups of students a little more individually, and then focus on the things that both they really care about and that also can't be delivered by someone who doesn't have that time to interact with the students directly.
That's interesting, because on its own, I would say, like, if you get rid of the hoops, like, what percentage of kids really want to just learn for its own sake? But if you tailor it that closely, like, so those who want to build projects get to focus on that, those who want to focus on theory get to focus on that, then I think it would be a higher percentage. So yeah, it would be interesting what could be done then.
Yeah, I think there's also, you mentioned like how many students want to learn for their own sake. There's a big, big difference here between different sides of the institutional spectrum. So you've got the super motivated high school students who are already on Coursera and have finished 4 courses before they even come to college. You have community colleges in the US and technical colleges with students who are really there for a clear vocational reason. You have liberal arts colleges where they're very interested in that seminar style stuff. And then mid-tier state schools where you get a whole mix of different students, some of whom are very motivated and others who just want to party for a couple of years. And then you're like prestige, Ivy Plus, R1 institutions. And to lump all of those people together, I think elides really important nuances about people's desire to learn and what they actually want out of learning. There was a 2016 survey of incoming freshmen into, I think it was only 4-year colleges. And that survey showed that 84% of students said that learning things that was important to them was a very important reason. It was on one of those Likert scales. That was a very important reason for attending college. But then you ask those same students on the other items, and 76% of them said that gaining a general education was very important. And even more than that, 80% cited getting a better job, and 74% said career-specific training. So you can have these kind of multifaceted reasons for wanting to be part of college, and that's at least on the expressed preferences side. But as you pointed out, the revealed preferences are somewhat different. There was another study by Philip Babcock, who is a social scientist, and he found that the amount of time that students spend actually doing their college work halved between 1961 and 2003. So at least the extent to which we're successful in getting students to learn for its own sake seems to not be as successful as we might hope. So maybe the suggestion that we were both building on, that perhaps with closer tailoring we could up those numbers and get back to the point where students are really self-motivated, is a possibility. I'm hopeful. At least I have to be optimistic, or else I'd need to change careers.
Right. I mean, it's challenging because probably a big part of the change over those decades is just more people going to college and university. So it could be people who wouldn't have gone in the past aren't as interested in just learning for its own sake.
Yeah, and particularly the GI Bill shifted the college demographic substantially and led to this kind of professionalization race or academic race where even to get entry-level jobs, you now need a college degree. And so for a lot of people who previously wouldn't have had the motivation or interest to go to college, they now have a reason why they need to go. And I do think that's been on net not beneficial. More people going to college is net beneficial, but I think we've overdone it in the sense that I think technical and vocational colleges actually have a really important role to play, and we shouldn't be forcing people through 4-year college, and particularly in places that have a research focus, for individuals who just want to get out there and start working.
Do you think countries like Australia might do a better job than America does?
We've made some very bad mistakes. We essentially eliminated the technical colleges in a series of reforms that happened in the 80s and merged them with the research universities. And what that's led to is a number of universities that have to build themselves as research universities and from which the government expects research outputs, but they don't necessarily have the talent to compete on the international stage and to produce the quality of research that I think really benefits the country. So I think, number one, we underinvest in research compared to the US. We spend, on all non-medical research, we only spend about $800 million a year in government funding for research, but then the pie gets split in places that really would better serve the public in their original form as technical colleges. And that's not to say that no good research comes out of these places, but the ratio is definitely different. They were designed as technical colleges, and trying to force, again, this happened in the US, this happened in Australia, forcing people into the research-intensive route, I don't think does a service to anyone.
Okay. Now, turning from the effects of AI on college specifically, what do you think the effects of both social media previously and AI as the upcoming trend, what do you think the effect of those have been on like teenagers and college students?
I think we're still a little early on the AI front to really know. Social media is a little better studied, and in particular, there was a consensus report of the National Academies. And for those who are unfamiliar, the National Academies is, if you're a scientist and you've achieved real preeminence in your field, you may be elected a member of the National Academy of Engineering or the National Academy of Science. And now and then they commission reports that attempt to ascertain what is the consensus in a field. These are really the gold standard for trying to understand what do researchers think. And there was one that came out just a couple of years ago on the impact of social media on youth well-being and adolescence. And the results were essentially inconclusive. They found that there was a small correlation between adolescent depression, anxiety, and social media use with a very unclear causal direction. But I've got a line here from the actual report, which is, the committee's review of the literature did not support the conclusion that social media causes changes in adolescent health at the population level. Nevertheless, there are harms, ... And I think we see this overplayed in the media a lot. It's a very popular line to say social media has ruined our kids, it's on net harmful. And there is some evidence in that direction, but certainly not enough to argue conclusively that social media is net harmful rather than net beneficial. There are also plenty of studies showing various beneficial effects, showing ease of communication among teens, people who can access community that they couldn't previously, LGBT youth in more insular communities that previously would have restricted that. And it's easy to say, oh, well, those kind of pale in regards to the harms and child grooming and depression, but the evidence really isn't there to argue conclusively that it's been harmful. It is very, very heavily disputed, though, and there are certainly individual scientists who take a fairly strong view one way or another. One thing that is fairly clear is that technology on the whole has displaced other childhood pastimes, and you could argue that in itself is a problem. So the fact that kids aren't going out and spending time outside because TV, computers, video games, social media, maybe AI, maybe they're staying at home talking to ChatGPT, but there definitely is that displacement effect. So to the extent that you have a strong prior, that the things that kids were doing prior to 1940 were preferable, then perhaps you'd have a reason to dislike not just social media, but all of these different technologies. Again, we've kind of seen this pattern with every new large childhood pastime. So everything from watching TV to newspapers were originally heralded as ruining the youth. So again, that doesn't tell us whether this time it's actually the real case, whether there is a real wolf. But there is reason to tread a little more cautiously than I think the media likes to do. Now, with respect to AI and social media use in people who already have problems, I think there are much clearer links. So there are patterns that are fairly apparent prior to children engaging in self-harm, where often there is a spike in social media use, but this is also correlated generally to different hours of sleep and wakefulness. So a lack of sleep and staying awake in the middle of the night is correlated with negative mental health outcomes. But again, that's unclear in which direction is the causal arrow. Are they up in the middle of the night and fiddling on their phone because they're depressed and they can't sleep because they have negative self-image or anxiety? Or is it the fact that they're up scrolling through social media at 3 a.m. that's making them depressed, or perhaps some of both? So I think there is a lot of room to explore that more, but I would be really hesitant to make some of the strong policy decisions that governments are making on the basis of believing that this causal link has already been established. I think the evidence just isn't there yet.
Right. I mean, I guess the question is, there's been this uptick in certain negative metrics like suicide among teenagers since 2012. So people say, oh, that's when, the smartphone and Instagram and things like that became popular. So if those aren't a strong enough cause, then you need to try to see like what else might have caused it. And is it that people are overprotective of their children and they don't get to play? Is it other factors? Is it just too complicated to resolve? So I guess that's the question. Like what is it? And then people look at social media and certain aspects of it seem very negative, like, these unrealistic beauty standards, people spending like so many hours a day, things like that. So then they feel like, oh, that must be the cause.
Yeah. Look, I think if you're a parent deciding for your child, look, I want to prevent my child from going on social media until a little later, and I want to speak to them very carefully and also keep watch on what they're doing. I think all of those are positive things potentially. But that's at an individual level rather than a population level. And so where I think there is a lot more evidence is for children in certain situations, social media use is going to be either net positive or net negative, and you can often tell based on contextual information about their situation, and parents are often well placed to make that judgment, assuming we've got good parents, which is often the case, but not always the case. The problem comes when you try and do population level interventions. Now, one place that we've seen kind of a similar-ish intervention was the phone ban in New York schools. And there was an economics paper that came out showing that there actually wasn't a substantial impact of the phone ban on educational outcomes, at least as far as they were able to measure. It was a relatively good study, but there was also some follow-up by some of the authors and related persons that said, just because it doesn't improve academic outcomes, it doesn't mean that we should let phones run amok in schools willy-nilly. There may be other benefits. So, for example, just in terms of classroom control, it's easier for a teacher to control the classroom when kids aren't all on their phones. There may be other social benefits. So again, my line isn't that there is no intervention that is worthwhile around technology and adolescence. It's more that we have to be very self-aware of which interventions are directly supported by the evidence and which we're more kind of playing a bit more of an experimental game or trying to tailor it less to a population level and more to a smaller context. So that could even be an individual school, a community, a classroom, or a family.
Yeah, I get that it's like a bit extreme for the government to do an outright ban on a whole country. On the other hand, I think the challenge is if a parent wants to ban it for their kids, but all the other kids use it, then that creates like a weird social dynamic. So it's very hard to do on an individual level. But if there was some way to do it on a community level, that seems like a good balance. And then people, if they want, they could leave the community. They could also do experiments then comparing the communities. So if they had some way to roll that out, maybe by school or district, that seems like it would be better than doing it across the whole country.
Yes. I've actually have some research in this area. Australia rolled out a social media ban to the whole country for anyone under 16. And the way they chose to do this was by regulating the social media platforms. So if you are a social media platform, you have to take reasonable steps to remove under 16s from your platform and to ensure they're not there. Now, this regulatory intervention has now been in place for about 6 months, maybe a little over, and there's been time for some initial results. Now, I have a couple papers on this, and there was also a paper by Cass Sunstein and some of his co-authors. I've forgotten who the first author was, but essentially they found that the ban was unsuccessful, and you still got this kind of disparate impact that you were talking about, where some kids are still on social media, and those kids self-identify the other kids who are not on social media as the uncool kids. So rather than solving the bullying problem, it may have exacerbated it. And this is also true in my research, in which we did focus groups with some young people and found that essentially all of them knew how to get around the ban if they wanted to. And the thing that was much more determinative of whether the ban worked or not was, what did the parents want to do with their own kids? Now, the Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has openly said that the motivation for this is to try and give parents ammunition to police their own kids. But as the Sunstein paper showed, unless you achieve kind of a critical mass of kids off social media, whether that's because the parents in the families have chosen to kind of enforce it or it's become technically impossible, unless you get to that kind of tipping point, it's not really going to be effective as a social intervention. And so I think that's more or less where it's landed. And even the regulator in charge of administering the social media ban has said similarly that she doesn't have adequate power to actually enforce the ban, and has kind of cautiously and subtly implied that it's not really working as it was designed.
I mean, I guess one thing that proponents of such bans could say in response would be that you just need stronger controls. Like, you make it even harder to get an account if you don't show even stronger proof that you're a certain age and that you're actually that person. So yeah, what would you say in response to that?
I think the more intense you make the restrictions, the more you start to impinge on civil liberties. So requiring everyone to present their ID when visiting a website is probably a non-starter for people in America, or at least from my understanding of American culture. And even in Australia, people are very uncomfortable with it, and it did not have very much political buy-in. So there's an explicit carve-out in the law that says platforms that choose to use government-provided ID as a way to ascertain age are not permitted for this to be the only way to establish that you're over age. And so what's happened is they're scanning people's faces and trying to guess how old you are based on a scan. Now, I have some forthcoming research on this that I unfortunately can't spoil, but with all the methods we tried, we were at least able to bypass them some of the time through the front door just by messing up your face or putting on a disguise. The models are getting better, so maybe that will stop. But more significantly, pretty much everyone knows how to use a VPN, even the 12 and 13-year-olds. And so unless this ban is kind of regulated globally and you start cracking down on VPNs, you're going to have a really, really hard time enforcing this at a technical level without starting to introduce internet-level censorship. Now, the UK has been floating this idea in the last couple months. There have been a couple members of the House of Lords who have endorsed a crackdown on VPNs, but there are a number of reasons why we should feel very wary about any such proposals, because that is going to have very significant knock-on effects. And given that the harms of social media are already somewhat disputed on net, the benefit of imposing a countrywide anti-VPN and internet censorship system is not something that I would endorse. In fact, quite the opposite.
I guess the question is similar to the physical locks that you mentioned before. Maybe you just need a certain level of difficulty, and then it's not expected to be on social media. I don't know if that's true. Maybe it's so trivial that kids will just do it no matter what. But once you have that certain level of difficulty, it doesn't have that same pressure, that social pressure. And then if some people want to get around it, that's okay. Like, we weaken the expectation of everyone to be on it, and maybe that's enough.
So there's a good point that's in parallel to that, which is, well, maybe it's not working because today's 13-year-olds have 14-year-old friends, and the 14-year-olds have 15-year-old friends, and the 15-year-olds were already on social media before the ban. And so perhaps it's just a generational thing. The last paper I published on this suggested that perhaps that's not true, and the reason we're a little skeptical of that is because we've found cross-age group socialization of the bypass methods. And so it's not just the 15-year-olds sharing with each other, It's groups of kids across year levels, particularly because there are sibling dynamics, sharing both why they use social media, what social media is, and why they might want to get around it. And so it's unclear the extent to which a generational shift will change it. It's still plausible because even that socialization mechanism can change as the generation changes. Perhaps there will be a discontinuity in the way that today's 8-year-olds relate to the 12-year-olds when they all age up and the 12-year-olds hit 16. But at least the current indications aren't positive for that.
I mean, I guess another way to approach these issues is, instead of trying to restrict it by age, maybe try to restrict or reduce the negative effects that happen for all ages. So if they have certain algorithms that are pushing certain content just to get people to click, but it makes them more depressed, maybe they could do something to reduce that and try to have some kind of like positive algorithm boost or things like that. I don't know if that's something that you think might be more realistic.
So there I'm much more bullish on our ability to intervene. The large social media platforms have been pretty terrible at transparency around their trust and safety programs, which is the name given to the programs designed to prevent harm to young people and scams and uploading of pornography that's not allowed on the site or whatever it happens to be. And those have been very, very closed to the public. There are some conferences where occasionally practitioners from the companies will discuss a little bit, but they're largely black boxes, and in recent years they've been becoming more and more opaque. There's a well-known story in which Facebook gave a permanent ban to some of my collaborators who were doing trust and safety research on the platform under the reason that they had violated the terms of service. Now, contractually, they are able to do that. They didn't violate the law by blocking these researchers. But my view is that normatively, we should have rules in place to ensure that researchers, public advocacy organizations, and governments can get more insight and might not necessarily be obligated to follow overly onerous terms of service that prevent us getting more information. So I think that's a first step, is more transparency. Transparency alone is not going to solve this, but I think enabling that transparency will then allow regulators and civil society organizations and academics who support the regulators to figure out what kinds of interventions might actually work. Now, I think you can still design experiments to try and determine what interventions might work even without support from the companies, but it's definitely a lot harder. Then on the next front, you have things like the age-appropriate design code, which is, I think, in the EU, which aims to set out what design elements and features should be in place and which shouldn't be in place for a platform that is accessible to a young person, or when a young person is identified as having an account on a platform, what experience they observe. Australia has gone in a slightly different direction, which is a digital duty of care, which attempts to impose a generalized legal obligation on the platforms to look after young users. And the platforms, I think, seeing the writing on the wall, have not been entirely opposed to either of these efforts. So I think there are a lot of things we can do in this direction. Which of these will actually pan out and deliver better outcomes and ensure that we can capture some of the gains without the negative effects? I'm not sure yet. I think there is a lot more work that needs to be done, but I broadly think that it is worth experimenting with these different regulatory interventions to understand and determine which might actually work out for us as a society.
Because it seems like there's a balance, like on one hand, trying to ban everything seems too extreme, but on the other hand, it's like such a unnatural practice, like some of the habits people have on this very new technology. So to just do nothing and be like, yeah, whatever. That also seems like maybe that's not the right response. Yeah. But if they could figure out something more balanced, then yeah, maybe they could help everyone. Okay, well, turning now back to software security. So recently, Anthropic released a model called Mythos, which was one of these new moments where AI showed how it, in a practical way, was just more powerful than anything before in terms of finding software vulnerabilities. And then they released that to like a restricted group of companies. But then they released another version, Fable, which was supposed to be the safe version of that for people to just use in general, where if they were trying to do things that seemed dangerous, like, find security exploits, then it would like block them from using it. So that's just like the basic background. And then the government briefly shut down access. They said that foreigners outside the US or even foreigners in the US can't be allowed to have access even to Fable. What do you think of the overall risk here that were shown by this new AI model? And what do you think of the government's initial response?
So maybe let's start with how dangerous are these things actually? And I think there you have two kind of sub-questions. Dangerous to whom and how, but also what is the marginal danger over the other models that are available, including the open source ones. So what everyone in industry is talking about at least is vulnerability tsunami, the notion that these tools introduce significant new cyber security risk because the ease of which they can find latent security flaws in generally code, but also sometimes systems. So more commonly, it's in a code base, they can find something like a buffer overflow and then even write a proof of concept exploit for it. We're not necessarily at the point where they can come up with a full exploit chain to find a buffer overflow in the JavaScript engine in Chrome, use that to escape the sandbox, and then do privilege escalation and get to the operating system. We're not quite there yet, but we're certainly at the point where the models are able to discover meaningful software security flaws and with a proper harness, with a proper set of supporting tools, distinguish between those that are false positives and true positives. So there's still a level of over-reporting that these do, but it's gotten to the point where if you get a few outputs of them, you can be reasonably confident, assuming you've used the right harness, that these are actual real bugs. So they're very good at the first part of that kind of chain, the discovery and the analysis, and then the verification. They're not as good at actually launching the full-scale cyber attack. So we're not seeing, at least to my knowledge, end-to-end attacks by swarms of Mythos bots out there in the wild. So there is some danger because our ability to patch is now a little slower than our ability to find vulnerabilities. Because to patch, you have to actually be awake, know that there is a vulnerability, and send your agent to go and fix it. And in the meanwhile, the attackers can be going off and finding new bugs. And if you were to do this yourself, if you were to ask a Mythos class model to find a vulnerability, there's no guarantee that you'll find the same one that an attacker has already found. So being proactive at the moment doesn't necessarily save you. These capabilities are at the moment pretty much on the frontier. So Mythos and GPT 5.6 Sol, which is the new OpenAI model released this past week, they're mostly on par, and they can both do this. But the open models and the competitors, the Chinese competitors, they're honestly not that far behind. So this is where I think we really have to be cautious about our policy response, because our policy response is only going to be effective for a certain amount of time, and these capabilities are pretty accessible. There's also quite a big question about short-term impacts versus the equilibrium that we reach. So a policy response that is good for the short term might not necessarily be pertinent to the equilibrium. And there was a talk by Nicholas Carlini, and he talked about the commoditization of this pretty specialized skill set of vulnerability research. And other observers in the media have also said, essentially what was once the purview of a few people with very specialized reverse engineering skills, myself included, can now be done by almost anyone. And I think that's where some of the danger is, and I think there's a lesson to learn there, not just about the danger from cyber attacks, but also CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear. And so my personal view as someone who's been in security for a long time is that we don't see large-scale bad things in the world as often as we might, is not because doing bad things is actually that hard. Assembling a dirty bomb is easier than you would hope that it is. If you don't care about the welfare of the person doing the synthesis that much, you can probably synthesize some pretty bad things. We know that organized crime is pretty good at synthesizing drugs, and explosives are, again, not that technically hard to do. Some of the reason why people haven't done it is because outside of state actors, people with the motivation to do terrible things in the world, the technical knowledge and capabilities to pull it off, and also the operational capacity to actually organize it, not only want to do it, have the technical skills to do it, but the ability to actually execute on a plan on a larger scale than just building something in a lab, has been a very limited set. You're talking about this fairly small set of people at the intersection of three relatively rare groups. Only certain people in the world are very operationally sophisticated. Only certain people are good at chemical synthesis. and only a certain group of people really want to do terrible things in the world. What I'm worried about with AI is it may be removing some of these distinctions. So it's by reducing the technical capabilities and also making even operational planning a little easier, it can increase the accessibility of some of these types of dangers. And so even while I don't think that the set of people who wish to do terrible things is going to expand that significantly, it will a little because of the reduced friction, but even though that set of people isn't expanding that much, I think there is a concern that the barrier for the existing people that we're worried about has been reduced. And we're seeing this. There was a report that came out of an Oxford University Centre about, I think it was Somalian groups planning piracy and terrorism operations using frontier models. And so that is the place where I'm really worried and where I think the government does have reason to worry. I think it is a different question whether export restrictions and the Defence Production Act are the right way to regulate those.
Okay, so if you think that there's a big concern here, but the measures that they took were maybe too extreme or just not correct, what do you think is a better approach?
So let's start with what they did. And I think part of the problem is they approached Anthropic as if they were the only entity that already had these capabilities, and that was just plainly untrue. OpenAI's models, even 5.5, the one from the prior release, was fairly competent at finding these things. Sure, it didn't have the level of hype as Mythos, and perhaps wasn't quite as effective, but the marginal difference in the capabilities wasn't that great. And at the same time, there are a lot of clouds around the government's story. So Anthropic and the government had been at odds and somewhat antagonistic to each other for some time, even while the government still desired their capability. And so it's unclear the extent to which the actions they took were really motivated by concerns and how much was politically motivated. And it seemed like this was another narrow jailbreak. So it worked sometimes, only unlocked certain capabilities and only for a limited time, and would also have been visible to some extent. The thing that is more worth worrying about is if someone can find a universal jailbreak that just turns off all the safeguards. And it didn't seem, based on the reporting, that this had actually been found. And so the remedy that the government chose, which was just to ban Mythos itself from non-US persons, both wasn't well tailored to the problem and also ignored the fact that these other models were available and the particular jailbreak that had been found didn't seem to be anything that significant. So what can we do? I think this is where we have a real problem because there's not a great answer yet. Anthropic's mode has seemed to be suggesting a coordinated pause. So they've offered to cease model development if everyone else ceases to do model development. But this is incentive incompatible. Everyone has an incentive to defect. And not only that, but potentially defect in secret. And so I can't see that working. At the same time, restricting things via the export controls also seems unlikely to work, particularly because the open source models really aren't that far behind the frontier, and the know-how of what you actually have to do to improve the models is mostly public. We might see a shutting down of a lot more research. So already the frontier labs have been publishing fewer of the key components needed to advance in academic venues and public venues. So we could see that further restricted and the government trying to push back on open research. But in the US regulatory environment, that's very hard to do. There are fairly strong First Amendment protections around academic speech. So I don't have any brilliant policy prescription that we can adopt today other than to say it's a hard problem and something we need to be working on and trying. And I know that's very unsatisfying, but I don't have the answers today.
Yeah, I mean, people have talked about doing a pause in research. They're talking about these more worrisome risks, like AI itself tries to do, take control or cause mass harm. For these specific risks, I think it's a little, these are a little bit smaller risks of people just using AI, at least at the level we're at currently, using AI to do bad. It could get worse, if they get access to super viruses and things like that. That could be really scary. But for these kind of risks right now, I feel like the approach of Anthropic might be a reasonable approach where you try to have multiple layers of detecting it And then maybe you could build on that. Like, I know we talked about, we don't want to require people to verify their identity, but in theory, if you had more knowledge of who's using your product and what they're using it for, you could detect bad players, either block it at the moment or detect it right afterwards so they can't keep on doing harm on an ongoing basis. That may be an approach that could work for now.
Yeah, so that's where we are seeing the labs doing a lot of stuff. So to do OpenAI's verified for cyber program requires you to submit some ID so they actually know who you are. And then they look at your transcripts and they probably are running models over the transcripts post hoc as well as live. So one of the common techniques that I've also done some work on is guard models. And the idea is before a tool call goes ahead, a second classifier or a second model looks at both the tool call and looks at the transcript to determine if what you're requesting to do should be allowed to go forward. And that might be for your own safety, or it might be because you're stepping outside the bounds of what the frontier lab wants to permit, either for cyber risk or for other reasons. Now, the problem is that there are still lots of attacks on the guard models, and a post hoc approach to preventing harm. So we're going to look over the transcripts later and ban people might still allow attacks through. There is a big colloquial literature on people who create new accounts whenever they get banned, jailbreak it to the extent they can, use the capabilities to do their little bit, get banned, pay another $20, open another account, make a little more progress, and through that methodology can actually assemble a fairly fearsome cyber attack on something or other, despite the existence of the guard models that are stepping in at various points and blocking them. There's also a lot of sensitivity to context depletion. So as you chat longer and longer with a model, the efficacy of the guard models will decrease as that context window fills up, as the size of the context that the guard model has to handle with increases. And so a defense in-depth approach is definitely what we're doing currently, what we should be doing, but there are still gaps in it, and those aren't plugged yet.
Yeah, I noticed I was just playing around with Fable for like a personal project, trying to like track everything I read and different things like that. And it put up these warnings for no reason at all, and then it switched off Fable, and it had nothing to do with anything. But I think that's just because the government made them be even more restrictive. I don't know if on their own Anthropic would have been as restrictive as that.
Yeah, the overblocking thing is quite funny and happens to me all the time. I'll be doing something totally benign, but because I'm a security researcher and my research papers have something to do with security, they get flagged very often. I haven't experienced that with GPT 5.6 yet, but they obviously are in a different regulatory position, different political position, and so are acting quite differently. And I think that's one of the dynamics to watch for here, is that the frontier labs all sit in a different position in the political and social ecosystem. And so the capabilities of their models that are permitted to users will likely end up being different. And this is both beneficial for users, there's good competition in the market, but also dangerous. And you can play the models off of each other. I had an instance where I was doing some security research, and GPT was getting annoyed at what I was doing, so I gave that specific task to Claude and took the results back from Claude and put it back into GPT. And you could imagine building a harness that does this for you, that looks for when you get blocked by one, sends it to the other with a slightly different context, and then takes it back to the first one again in a new context window.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I guess, another case where if they really knew the identity, it could help, because if they see a pattern of people repeatedly doing something, then they could be blocked. And if they knew their identity, it wouldn't be as easy to just create another account. Like in America, if you have to give your credit card and some other verification, it's not as easy. Like the credit card is attached to a name. So there are certain levels where I feel like it would be easier to control, and there would also be a very strong incentive for the companies to control. Like Anthropic has issues of distillation attacks where companies are just training their models on Anthropic's advanced models. So if they could verify people who are doing that, then they could shut them down. It would be very beneficial for them. I guess it gets harder in other countries for them to have that level of control, but it seems like something that they would want to do anyways.
I think there is some benefit to be gained here by information sharing across the frontier labs. And this has often been difficult for companies in the US to do information sharing, even about threats and threat actors, because of antitrust laws, which restrict collaboration and cartels. And I think that's a good thing to have the antitrust laws, but I do think the regulatory security of having explicit carve-outs as opposed to implicit nods could be a benefit. So establishing a platform for sharing between the frontier labs of bad actors and threat signals would, I think, be one thing that would help with this problem. Maybe even we could get some collaboration cross-border, but that's probably wishful thinking at this point.
I mean, that hopefully longer term is something that would need to be worked on if people wanted to do things like slow AI development. Okay, and then turning just to people using AI. So agentic AI has become much more powerful. It's something software developers are much more familiar with, but I think it's starting to spread into the wider world where you're not just chatting with the AI, but you're telling it to do stuff and it goes off and it will spawn sub-agents, it will do tasks, it will complete projects, create, spreadsheets, things like that. So what are the main risks there of people using it? And people who use it, what are the main things they could take to protect themselves from those risks?
So in terms of the risks, I think a good place to start is the lethal trifecta, which is a term coined by Simon Willison, who's a tech writer and coder. The lethal trifecta is access to private data or systems, exposure to untrusted content, and the ability to act externally or communicate. And all of those things are present in a modern day coding agent, just in even the codex for work, I think is the new OpenAI branding of it, and Claude Cowork. Anyway, so the problem here is that you gain a lot of utility by giving agents this lethal trifecta. If you want to have your agent fill out your expense reports at your business, you need to give it access to a private system. You need to give it access to the content of wherever you are storing your receipts, and you have to give it the ability to act. But at the same time, this is the only way to kind of achieve the task. And so I think there is the largest risk, is that our incentive structure is such that we are strongly incentivized to do the exact things that increase the risks substantially. In my own life, I had one of the instances of AI deleted all my files. In this particular story, I'd messed up my cloud sync for just my files on my computer because I had a Git repository that had too many little files, and you should never put one of those inside your cloud sync thing because then algorithmically it's bad and it has to do too many database operations. Details. And I told my agent, hey, can you please fix the syncing? And it tried a whole bunch of things. Eventually, it came to the conclusion that the cloud sync repository was too messed up, and the best thing to do would be a total reset. Not realizing that the sync state of the files was mixed. And so some were only present locally, and a reset would result in them being deleted. Now, fortunately, I'm a good computer scientist and back up things regularly aside from the cloud sync. But that was a really nice example of where the intent was actually aligned. The agent was trying to do the right thing. It missed a critical piece of information. I'd given it access, and yet it still resulted in substantial damage, even though I was able to recover from it. It was painful, but able to recover from it. And so I think here what we're missing, or up until recently, is that the same way as we moved in the 2000s and the 2010s from thinking about browsers as just another app to thinking about them as equivalent to an operating system in complexity and importance, I think we also need to think about agentic systems the same way. So they have complex components, a very large trust boundary in that we're giving them exposure to a lot of untrusted content, just like we would for our browser. And we need to start creating boundary mechanisms to enable us to deal with it a lot better. And so the harms that one could experience are really the same sorts of harms as you could do yourself by typing in commands that you haven't vetted. And so that attack surface is really broad. So anything you can do to mess up your own stuff, the agent can probably do as well. And that is the big problem.
Right. I mean, some of it could be addressed in like a simpler manner. Like often you could have it run in a sandbox and you don't really need it to be running outside the sandbox. Like you give it access, let's say you're working on code, you give it access to the project it's working on. It could read things from outside, like if it needs to research and find libraries, things like that, but it wouldn't be able to like delete your actual data. So I feel like that's an initial step, but then people might just default to like giving it root access to everything on their computer. And that's where it becomes a problem, that like default.
And setting up a sandbox is painful and you need to know what the specific permissions are that this thing should have access to. And people who work in distributed systems have gotten better at doing this, but it's still a real pain. Like, you try and use Linux C groups to isolate things, or Docker containers, but lock down the permissions there, or Kubernetes, or whatever it is, whatever your distributed system of choice is. When you try and lock it down, it ends up being quite painful and a lot of overhead, despite the significant advances we've made. One place where we did actually make real headway was in browser sandboxing. And so now escaping from the browser sandbox as a piece of malicious code is actually legitimately quite difficult. The other thing we were able to do is segment parts of a browser's memory from other parts of the browser. So isolating different tabs in their own process, separating cookies by developing protocol level restrictions that isolate different security domains has been effective. And I think porting that same approach again to agents would be a way to make some progress. I think it's still a long and hard road, but there is hope, and we have architected these things before.
Right. Yeah. I mean, some of it's just figuring out the right balance, because they'll have people running it on completely unrestricted mode. And then on the other end, you have where it asks you before it does any little thing, like before it just like reads a file. And it's like, there's no risk you could read a file. And so they need to find that balance where the defaults are pretty good for security. Like, it makes sense what it has access to. It's rare that it needs to ask you for something, but when it does, you actually review it and don't just click yes right away.
No, there's also the Ariel using the agent versus my grandmother using the agent. And those require different models of what to ask permission for and when. So I know that there are certain people in my life who, when they're asked to click yes on something, will always click yes. And certain people that I've trained by being my mother in particular, who I've trained to always click no, do not grant permission, no matter even if it would be useful, and she suffers a loss of utility. Now, perhaps there was an overcorrection in that direction, but I think there's potentially an interesting path forward here, using guard models who understand not only the technical context, but also the user context, and can prompt for permission appropriately. And so already you see this if you're using the ChatGPT interface for the agent-based interface, Codex. You can already turn on a feature which allows a guard model to review the action first, and then to prompt you if it senses a mismatch between the gravity of the action that it wants to perform and the direct relevance to the instruction that you gave it. So if the thing that it wants to do is medium potential for damage, but very high salience directly related to your instruction, it might not prompt you. Whereas if it is a fairly risk-free action, but is not that related, it still might not prompt you, and then only in the case where it is high risk and medium authorization or low authorization will it go ahead and ask you explicitly.
Yeah, so turning away from people using agentic AI just to broader consumers, it seems that, the internet allowed much more scams and hacking and all that, and now the bad guys using AI could bring it just to a much bigger scale. And there's been an increase in more of these scams. It's becoming a bigger problem. So, regular users, and then, maybe the elderly and all these people, they just go on the internet, and there's just so many risk surfaces for them. There's scams through email and on websites and all over the place. So what do you think is like a broader solution where we could help these people just in their general usage of technology and try to reduce the number of scams that have been happening?
There are a few things I think we can do. One of the pieces is post regime that provides some kind of social insurance for when things go wrong. And this already exists in the US in the form of Regulation E around card issuance, which provides a protection against liability to users of credit cards. And so if you didn't authorize a transfer, then you get made whole. And I think we can extend this notion to also push payment fraud, which is when you press the authorize button, but you were being hoodwinked. Now, obviously, there are some challenges with doing this, because then people will just say, oh, I didn't mean to send this person the money, get it back for me. And then that can open up payment processors to more fraud against the payment processors. But the UK is moving in that direction, and I think such a regime is reasonable. I think it would have to be designed carefully, but I think that's something we can do ex post. It functions just like social insurance. Everyone pays an extra fee to the merchants, and then the merchants pass it on to the the payment scheme providers. I'm eliding some of the details there. When you pay the merchant, often it's actually going to the payment processor. But essentially, you're paying a surcharge for the benefit of having this scheme around you. And it is somewhat effective. There have been many times in my life where I have done a chargeback or where there are unauthorized charges on my card, and that has helped. So I think we can do that in more places. Zelle is one of the places in the US where this does not exist very much, and I think we can do a better job there. So that's on the ex post side. On the ex ante side, so before the damage happens, I think there are some defensive measures. So as deep fakes become more prominent, I think one good thing that everyone can do is come up with a family safe word. So there is a word or a phrase that is shared with family members, and if a family member asks you for a large amount of money because they claim to have been abducted and put in a Costa Rican prison and need $5,000 for bail transferred via Western Union, if they don't say the family safe word, then you know that it's a deep fake or that otherwise something has gone wrong. So having that kind of trusted side channel or back channel that you know is, I think, something that's very easy to do. I think also the technical design of some products can be improved. One thing that some platforms can do is give you a trusted contact. So let's say I want to transfer $40,000 out of an account. I can say for any transaction over $20,000, my trusted contact also has to approve it on their device, and that can be cryptographically verified. Now, there's obviously a balance here against friction, and some people don't have a great trusted contact in their lives, but giving people that option is another way to empower them and perhaps suggesting it in many instances. But also the usual advice still works, at least for the time being. Kind of keeping an eye out for obvious signs of scams, not clicking yes to things, having your wits about you, not using the same password for everything, keeping your devices up to date so drive-by malware doesn't work. All of those sorts of like basic security hygiene haven't gone away just because the threat landscape has changed.
Do you think we could also develop systems using AI that just run in the background and detect if there's any issue? So like it would be running in the browser or whatever platform, and if it detects like, this looks very suspicious, it will alert the user, and they could have different settings to like protect them.
Yeah, I think we can do more of that. That's already being done quite a lot on the back end. So there was a nice podcast with Patrick McKenzie called Complex Systems, and he spoke to someone from Stripe, his former employer, about their use of AI in fraud detection. And there are very clear patterns for money transfers that are likely to be fraudulent, or even that authorized push payment fraud, where someone authorized it, but they were doing so under the influence of someone who was acting illegitimately. And so I think we can do a mix probably of both. There's probably room to do more on the front end to protect users themselves and their experience, but also on the back end to flag those things and to put in place more friction when someone tries to do something that the system tags as being highly likely to be fraudulent.
Yeah, it's just interesting because it's becoming worse and worse, I feel like. And right now it doesn't seem like enough is being done about it. But yeah, hopefully these defensive systems will be built out.
Look, there is a bright spot. And so you see all these news stories like grandmother loses life savings. But there was a paper out by a collaborator of mine, Alyssa Redmiles, a couple years ago that found that the median amount that people actually lose to scams in their lives is not particularly high. It was, by memory, on the order of a few $100s, which for some people can be really, really significant. But for the median American, it's survivable. It's just that the long tail of people who really get hurt by this is significant, and those harms can be life-changing. So I do think we need to protect people, but I also think that there is room for some optimism that both the defensive technologies that we have, the training we can do with people, and the size of the problem, at least in the next little while, seems hopefully manageable. Maybe I'm overly optimistic, but I like to look outside and see the sun.
So do you think in the long run that the balance between defense and offense, that defense will come out stronger and the scams will be reduced?
In the long run, I am optimistic that humans will develop both the social technologies and the digital technologies to be more protective. And a social technology includes something like insurance, includes stuff like basic literacy on a societal wide level. And then the digital technologies include all the kind of fraud combating AI that we've talked about, as well as more traditional kinds of mechanisms. And I think that we have a wonderful history as a civilization of being able to address problems on a large scale, not eliminate them entirely. We haven't eliminated war or starvation, but we've been able to do significant things to address both of those problems, even while some days we make them worse, and in some ways. So I think that in the long run, the dynamic equilibrium of the kind of cyber and scam landscape is going to end in the favor of the good and the kind.
Okay. And if people want to find more about you online, where could they find you?
So my academic webpage is at coney.info, COHNEY.info, but I'm also sometimes active on Twitter and very active on Google Scholar. And on Twitter and any other platform, I am at Shaananc, SHAANANC.
Okay, Shaanan, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much. Good to speak.